Welcome back to the IEA's podcast Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week we're looking at hydrogen. Back in 2020, it felt like hydrogen was in the spotlight. There was a spike in new projects, nations announced hydrogen strategies, and it's easy to see why. The most abundant element on Earth carries a lot of energy, and that offers the potential to help countries reach their energy goals. But since then, the industry has faced some headwinds. Using low-emissions hydrogen in sectors like steelmaking or long-distance transport needs new infrastructure and comes with a cost for a market still in its relative infancy. But today, there are reasons to believe the production of low-emissions hydrogen will grow strongly in the coming years. And to hear why, we're joined by hydrogen analyst José Bermudez. José, thanks for joining us today. Now, as I said in the intro, there has been this air of excitement around hydrogen, but before we get into that, I think it's just worth reminding ourselves of the process of turning hydrogen into energy, because it's a little more complicated than getting energy out of, say, fossil fuels.
Yes, well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me here today, Dan. And yes, indeed, there has been a lot of interest on hydrogen. It has some interesting features when you try to use it in the energy sector. Like, for example, it can be burned to produce energy and not emitting CO2. So this has attracted a lot of interest in terms of the possibilities of decarbonizing the energy sector. Now, it's true that hydrogen is also the most abundant element on the universe, but unfortunately, normally comes combined with other elements. So for producing it first, we need to expend a bit of energy in separating it from these elements. Today, for example, practically all the hydrogen that we produce is coming from fossil fuels, mostly natural gas and also to a lesser extent from coal. Now, the thing is that when you use fossil fuels to produce hydrogen, it leads to very large CO2 emissions. And for that reason, governments and the industry sector have been putting a lot of effort in developing and deploying new technologies for produce hydrogen more cleanly, or what we call low emissions hydrogen.
Now, we're going to talk a lot about low emissions hydrogen on this podcast. So some listeners might have heard of blue hydrogen or green hydrogen or even pink hydrogen. And it can feel confusing. So maybe we could just focus on what we're talking about today for the sake of this podcast.
So low emissions hydrogen is that one which can be produced either from renewable electricity or nuclear electricity in devices called electrolyzers, which split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. When we use sustainable biomass as the feedstock for the production of hydrogen, or also when we use fossil fuels, but we add also carbon capture after the process. As you said, there's many people that tend to use color to refer to the different technologies for produce hydrogen. And this has some benefits in terms that it facilitates the dialogue because it removes technical jargon. However, we prefer to speak about low emissions hydrogen because using colors has some drawbacks. People tend to use the color blue for hydrogen which is produced from fossil fuels and carbon capture. However, when we use the blue color, we don't say whether it's 10% of the CO2 emitted that is captured or 60% or 90%. And of course, depending on that, the level of emissions is different.
And I think as well, it's just worth reminding ourselves about the way the world uses hydrogen. What are some of the commercial uses? What are some of the ways it's used in the energy sector? So can you talk us through some of the ways that hydrogen is valuable to us?
Yes, today we already produce and use a lot of hydrogen, but it's mostly used in the form of industrial feedstock in chemical plants for producing fertilizers, for producing solvents, many other chemical products, or for oil refining. Now, one of the good things of hydrogen is that it could also be a very versatile fuel. It can be used in practically all energy applications, you name it, transport, aviation, shipping, buildings, energy storage, many different applications. But also it can be transformed in what we call hydrogen-based fuels, for example, ammonia or methanol or synthetic kerosene. And these fuels are more easily transported and stored than hydrogen and have many of the same applications as hydrogen as a fuel.
Right, now let's talk a little bit about the price point, because I'm interested to know how the price of low emissions hydrogen compares with hydrogen that is produced from fossil fuels?
Yes, actually, today the biggest barrier for the adoption of low emissions hydrogen is the cost. As a reference point, producing hydrogen from fossil fuels normally costs between a bit less than $1 to $5 per kilogram of hydrogen. If we add carbon capture to those processes, we also add a cost, which varies between $0.50 and $1 per kilogram additionally. And then when we think about electrolysis, we also have a range of costs, which is much wider. It goes from around $3 per kilogram to well above $10. But today, only China has managed to be close to this bottom part of this range, no? And this is thanks to very low electricity cost, very low electrolysis technology cost, but also very low cost of capital, which is basically the cost at which project developers borrow money from investors to develop their projects. The good thing is that electrolysis has a tremendous potential to reduce its cost, both in China and the rest of the world, with the continuous decrease of electricity, thanks to innovation, benefiting for economies of scale as the technology starts being deployed, and also by reducing the cost of capital as investors get more familiar with the technology. So we expect that this cost gap between low emissions hydrogen and hydrogen produced from traditional fossil-based routes will decrease over time significantly.
Okay, I think it's worth stepping back for a second and just going back to the beginning of the decade, because there was this surge in interest in hydrogen. There were more projects being announced. There was interest from governments. So could you talk us through why was there this interest in hydrogen at that time?
Yes, I think 2020 was a turning point, not only for hydrogen, but for the global sector overall. No? It was the moment at which many governments started announcing commitments for net zero emissions. Before that, decarbonization focused specifically on power generation, but when you want to go to net zero emissions, it encompasses also decarbonizing industry, decarbonizing transport, agriculture, the building sector, many other things. And for that, you need a new set of technologies. And here is where hydrogen versatility comes into play. We already have spoken about some users that need hydrogen, like in the chemical sector and refining. And this will always need hydrogen because it's a fundamental part of their process. So the only way of decarbonizing them is low emissions hydrogen. Now, apart from the decarbonization driver, there are two other factors that have driven this interest on hydrogen lately. One is energy security, which has come back to the center stage of international dialogues. Hydrogen can help in diversifying energy supply, so then enhancing energy security, but also for some countries that are depending on fossil fuel imports can help in reducing that dependency. And the second driver is industrial competitiveness. Several major economies have lately put forward new industry strategies in which hydrogen technologies feature strongly, particularly the manufacturing of novel technologies such as electrolysis or fuel cells.
And is there a real-world way that perhaps we can understand that increase in interest, what people could actually see on the ground?
Yeah, so for example, if we go back to 2020, we have only a handful of demonstration projects for the production of low-emission hydrogen. Then, since then, there were hundreds of announcements from new projects, and now we actually have more than 200 of these projects that have already reached a final investment decision.
Okay, now, over the last few years, there's been a narrative, perhaps, of the hydrogen bubble bursting. Now, I'm interested to know how fair you think that is, and perhaps what the data shows us about what's been happening over the last few years.
We are seeing a lot of negative news in the headlines, project delays, cancellations, reduced ambitions for adoption of low-emission hydrogen, and this has created a feeling that the sector may have stalled. But the reality is that those ambitions or those announcements created very high ambitions for a new energy carrier that is still in its nascent stages. So low emissions hydrogen is a new product entering the market. And every time that a new product enters in the market, it faces barriers. We have already mentioned the high cost of producing it, but there are other barriers. For example, in the case of demand. The agreements that have been signed between potential users and potential producers of low emissions hydrogen are very preliminary, and this creates uncertainty in the sector. Or, for example, in terms of infrastructure, most of the production and demand of hydrogen today are co-located. But when you think about the optimal places to produce low-emission hydrogen, they may not be close to the demand center, and this requires new pipelines to be built. So all these barriers have prevented faster adoption to meet those high expectations. But when we look at data, we actually have a sector that is progressing and reaching important milestones.
Okay, so let's look ahead to 2030. So what does IEA data say about how the production of low emissions hydrogen, how could that change over the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, so based only on projects that are already operational or under construction or that have reached a final investment decision, we estimate that low emissions hydrogen production will surpass 4 million tons by 2030, which is 5 times more than the production that was achieved in 2024, which is the last year that we have updated data. This means that low emissions hydrogen production will grow from less than 1% of global hydrogen production to 4% by 2030. There is potential for much more because the total pipeline of projects announced could reach up to 37 million tons. But how far between those 4 and 37 million tons we can reach is very uncertain still today. But also let me give you another example of the progress of the sector is achieving, which is the size of the projects. In 2021, the largest electrolyzer in operation in the world had a capacity of 30 megawatts. In 2025, in China, the biggest electrolyzer started operation, and it was 500 megawatts of capacity. But if we think on the largest project in the world, which is today under construction in Saudi Arabia, it's expected to reach more than 2 gigawatts of capacity by 2027. And this is a 75-fold increase in the size of the projects in just 6 years.
So there is a level of uncertainty about exactly how much hydrogen that could come online by 2030. Maybe you could just tell us a bit more, expand on why there is that uncertainty, why perhaps there's a lack of clarity.
We have been tracking all the announced projects around the world since 2019 and estimating how much production they could reach by 2030 if they will be materialized according to their plans that companies announced. This is not a forecast. This is an estimate that we made only based on company announcements. When we did this assessment in 2024, we estimated that the production from all those projects could reach nearly 50 million tons by 2030. But when we reassess this estimate in 2025, we see that the potential production by 2030 had decreased down to 37 million tons. And this is a result of 3 different events. First, projects that were aiming to be operational before 2030 have been delayed. Second, several projects have been put on hold indefinitely, waiting for enhanced or improved market conditions. And third, project cancellations. But I have to say that this is not only bad news. Of course, it shows a certain level of uncertainty, but it's also normal in novel technologies that go through this maturation process in which only the most robust projects that are based in locations with supportive regulatory frameworks get moved into the most advanced stages of development.
Okay, now let's think about how to increase the amount of hydrogen being produced. Does that need to come from governments? Does that need to come from the private sector? What are some of the levers that can be pulled?
So policy making is fundamental at this stage. As we said, the low emissions hydrogen is a nascent sector, and it faces numerous barriers that requires government actions to help stakeholders to overcome those barriers. Without the right policies in place, things are not going to happen or are going to happen very slowly. Now, when we speak about government action, these tend to be misunderstood as subsidies. And what we really mean is a complete policy framework that can provide long-term clarity on which will be the future marketplace for hydrogen. This, of course, includes support schemes, but also, for example, policies to stimulate demand. There is also a need of having clear rules on what is low emissions hydrogen, so not based in colors, but based in measurable parameters. And for example, there is also a need of a supportive environment for innovation. Innovation will be fundamental to keep moving forward with cost decrease on technologies related to production and use of low emissions hydrogen.
Now let's think about the regions in the world that are currently the right conditions for hydrogen production to grow. Tell us about which parts of the globe are growing right now and potentially maybe growing up to 2030.
Yes, of course. There are several regions in the world that are taking significant steps in the adoption of low emissions hydrogen. On one hand, we have North America, which is today the largest producer of low emissions hydrogen, mostly with hydrogen produced from fossil fuels and carbon capture, because there is a lot of expertise in large oil and gas projects. Then we can think about as well on China. China in 2024 accounted for a very minor share of production of low emissions hydrogen, but when we speak specifically about electrolysis, the story is different. China is driving today the deployment of electrolysis. It accounts for 60% of the global installed capacity, but also 60% of all investment decisions. And we estimate that it will become the largest single producer of low emissions hydrogen by 2030. There has been some progress in Europe as well. It's a region with high cost for hydrogen production, and there has been some issues with certain regulations that have been delayed, but still we have seen several major projects starting construction, both for electrolysis or fossil fuels with CCUS. And finally, I want to speak about two regions that are like newcomers. So first, the Middle East. We already mentioned that they have the world's largest electrolysis project under construction in the world, and it's a region with a lot of renewable potential, cheap natural gas, and access to CO2 storage capacities, but also has a lot of expertise in terms of exporting fossil fuels, which the region aims to leverage to export as well hydrogen-based products. And the other one is India, which after a slow start now has the second largest electrolysis project under construction in the world and has very interesting policies to adopt low emissions hydrogen in refining and in fertilizers.
Okay, lastly, we have spoken in this podcast about what has been an air of pessimism around hydrogen, but of course there are lots of ways of looking at it. So maybe you could just compare the growth of hydrogen production with other energy sectors, just to give us a sense of actually how fast it's growing.
Yes, so based only on the committed projects, we estimate that low emissions hydrogen production will grow from less than 1% of global hydrogen production in 2024 to 4% or around 4% in 2030. This would put low emissions hydrogen growth on par with the fast expansion that we have seen, for example, for solar photovoltaics between 2010 and 2020.
Okay, José Bermudez, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you, Daniel.